Welcome to the Courier Journals, conversations from the front line of the courier and logistics industry. Hello everyone, thank you ever so much for tuning in to another episode of the Courier Journals. I always say I don't want to start off with an apology, and I don't, but this is pretty much turning into a bi-weekly podcast at this point, isn't it? So I am sorry for that. I promise. When I finally got the staff in place, I will absolutely nail this thing weekly, and if we can go twice weekly and I can do a solo episode and I can get a guest on, then happy days. But at the minute I am just recording as and when I can. So to give you guys a bit of an indication of my workload at the minute, I'm obviously managing all our same day department. I'm trying to recruit across our multi-drop depots because we've had a bit of a surge in volume, as you tend to expect at this time of year. Obviously it sounds silly in July saying this, but peak is literally around the corner. It's ridiculous, but that is how the business works, how the industry works, which I'm sure you all know that are listening. So I'm recruiting across ample multi-drop depots at the minute. And then I've also got the telesales executive, which I've now got to recruit for after losing my indoor sales executive. And I'm also recruiting for a traffic controller, given the fact that our same day has become a little bit more busy and will continue to do so naturally in the next couple of months. So it is a little bit hectic. So I do apologise for that. I have made the conscious decision to reveal if anyone's been listening, I've been speaking to a multi-drop company, a new entrant to the market. They are an international firm, but they are a new entry to the UK who tend to take as much of every business as they can. I will reveal their name next week as soon as I have signed, sealed, and basically ended our relationship with them, because as you've been aware, we did withdraw from Manchester, Birmingham and London because the rates were just so low. So as soon as we've got all that boxed off, I will reveal that next week, so that I will reveal their name if anyone does feel like they can make the rates work that they was offering. And best of luck to you if you can, because we most certainly cannot. If you are listening to the Courier Journals for the first time, thank you ever so much for tuning in, and please do us a very big favour and like and follow us on all platforms of social media where possible. So that's Facebook, Instagram and TikTok. If you are listening on either YouTube or Spotify, please do subscribe on the relevant channels. You don't realise how much it does help us and the algorithm and getting people to see us a little bit more, I guess, and listen more importantly. Moving on the topic of social channels, thank you to everyone, as always, that does get involved in the discussion. If you did listen to the last episode, which was episode 12, and that was why good courier companies go bust, Mark C1290 did respond again, because I did offer, I guess, not necessarily a controversial opinion back to Mark, but I kind of explained to Mark and was very honest that often when we are posting on CX, we will post the maximum we have in the job before it becomes, I guess, not worthwhile for us to do the job. So we spoke about how sometimes we'll tend to take a 10% margin. If that's what it takes to get the job covered, we'll take just the 10% margin. There has been times where we've taken a loss on a particular job if it makes sense. So I gave an example how we was doing 5 jobs for a customer one day, and then we had a job that was in the arse end of nowhere and we decided to take a £10 loss on the job. We'll do that. But 90% of the time, we won't be prepared to take a loss on the job. So what we'll do is we'll post on CX and we'll put pays X. And that normally will involve us taking a 10% margin. So for example, we had a job today. It was an 18-ton job. It was going about 230 to 250 miles. And I posted pays X. It involved us taking, I think it would have been about 100, I think we would have made about £130 on the job, and it was around 230 to 250 miles. It was an 18-ton. We paid £900 on the job for the record, and it needed a pallet truck and a tail lift. But yeah, we made about 130 on the job and the driver got 900. So yeah, in terms of margins and percentages of what we make, it wasn't a ton. If we'd have paid £1,000, to me, it's not worth it for 30 quid, because whilst, you know, there's a lot of talk about payment terms and things like that, we still only get paid 30 days end of month by our customer as well. And if we're delayed with that payment, it means we're actually paying out before we're getting in. And for the sake of 30 quid on a job that's worth £1,000, to us, it's just not worth it. It really isn't. So we made 130 on that job, which probably was just over 10%. So yeah, not bad for the driver, not a bad earning for the driver at all. But yeah, Mark got back to us again, and as always, Mark, I do really appreciate you always providing feedback on the episodes. It doesn't go unnoticed, and as I say, super appreciated. So Mark responded by saying, I appreciate your honesty in how you do business. I agree that common sense would solve a lot of the issues, and hope that listeners who maybe are having issues with rates or their expectations will learn what a fair rate is and how to make it work for them. And this goes back to me also on the same episode, and I don't want to go into last week's episode, well, the last episode, should I say, the last episode too much, because if you've not listened, go and listen. But I do talk about how I'm finding that a lot of drivers are quoting me as the main contractor an end user rate, and it's just crazy. And I'll give an example of that. So I'm involved in a couple of WhatsApp groups as well as being on CX, because a lot of drivers aren't on CX anymore, and sometimes the way to tap into them is through these different WhatsApp groups. So I put a message out on these WhatsApp groups, and I said I had a load. It was from the Yorkshire area going down to South East London. The load, don't get me wrong, I think it weighed about a ton, and it was going on a long wheelbase van. So I'm aware that, you know, not all long wheelbase vans can take that. However, it's obviously, it was about again, probably around the 220, 230 mile mark, and it was, we still charge our customer a long wheelbase van rate, right? So our prices don't change to the customer just because this particular load weighs a ton. And I'm not joking, someone come back to me and quoted £600. Now, I'm not ignorant to the fact that it weighs a ton, and you know, I might expect you to charge me a little bit more for it. You know, that might be the case, but it's 220 miles and you are charging me £600. At this point, it's not even an end user rate, like it's rocket fuel rates. What are these people putting in their vans? Good Lord God in heaven. So anyway, that's the type of sometimes rates that I'm getting quoted by drivers. As I say, go and get your own end users, and even at that price, you'll definitely struggle. It baffles the brain sometimes. In that instance, if that was the price that I was consistently getting quoted, I'd have just told my customer that we couldn't cover that job. It really isn't worth it. We'd have been literally losing hundreds of pounds on that job. Crazy rates. Anyway, that's enough of episode 12. This is obviously episode 13, which is what really happens behind the scenes of a same-day courier job. And I guess essentially today I'm taking you behind the curtain, no pun intended. From the moment a customer picks up the phone or sends that email to the second that the pod lands in their inbox, here's what really happens behind most same-day courier deliveries. So the phone rings or the email lands in the email inbox, right? And it's about gathering as much information you can as quickly as you can. And the reason why I say as quickly as you can, right, is because if the goods weren't urgent and they didn't need to be there urgently, they'd have used a next day provider. And I think that's sometimes a point that you've really got to stress, because drivers want as much information as possible. And I get it, right? I get it, because I've done the job myself. It's far easier when you've got all the information to hand, whether it be a site delivery contact, the time the site delivery point closes, all that information. It's great to have. But these people are trying to book this job urgently, and sometimes they don't provide all that information to the shipper. The shipper may even still ask for it and it's not provided. So it's about getting as much information you can as quickly as you can. The first thing you want to obviously get is the collection and delivery addresses, which again, different breed in itself, isn't it? I can't believe on this note, by the way, the amount of drivers that I speak to on CX that don't use what 3 words. I just can't believe it. And I'll provide what 3 words in the notes on CX, and they'll literally still go to the postcode, ring me and say, I don't know where I'm meant to be. And I'll say, have you used what 3 words? And they'll be like, what's that? What do you mean? What 3 words are you on about? And I'm like, oh my God. Drivers, if you are listening to this and do not use what 3 words, please install and use what 3 words. It will help you out in an abundance. It really, really will, because it literally takes you to the square meter. So when you are doing deliveries for things like construction companies, and we do a lot for construction companies, which is one of the reasons why we use it so frequently, it will literally take you exactly where that construction is being built. So I cannot recommend it enough. If I can give you any advice from today's pod, please download what 3 words. So we'll get the collection and the delivery address. We'll often, where we can, get the what 3 words. The other really useful information to have is the dimensions and the weight. Now, I've got to be brutally honest again here. What we often do when we onboard a new client is we'll give them I guess you could say like a package or a guideline as to what vehicle can take what in terms of weight and DIMS. And we kind of leave it up to them. We do obviously point out the discrepancies between vehicles, so when it gets between a certain point, we make it explicitly clear to them that they do have to declare the weight. So for example, if you're hitting that 900 kg mark and you're looking to have a long wheelbase van, we will turn around and say, look, do tell us when it hits this point, because we've got to make sure that this vehicle can take your goods from destination A to destination B. Similarly with the actual DIMS, you know, obviously they do vary in size as well. We had a scenario whereby we was booking a long wheelbase van and a new driver to CX quoted on our job, and he turned around and thought that his long wheelbase Sprinter at 3.6 meters, I think it was the biggest van you could get, and he couldn't believe that there was vans bigger than this 3.6 meter Mercedes Sprinter van that he had. Needless to say, lessons were learnt that day. The other thing that you've got to consider is time constraints. As we've just mentioned, one of the things that you should always try and get is, you know, knowing what time your delivery point shuts. But you've also got to be really careful with this as well. So again, if you've listened to previous episodes, I went out to meet a new customer in St. Helens, and one of the things that they said was they found it so irritating that one of their old courier companies that they used to use, that by the way have an excellent reputation, but one of the old courier companies that they used to use would specifically ask them what was the latest time they could deliver. And they wasn't particularly really interested in what time the delivery point was shut. They was trying to see if they could co-load the products, because they didn't have different pricing mechanisms. You just got a price for a same day delivery. So they would try and co-load as much as they could without actually telling the customer explicitly, look, we want to know what time your delivery point closes, because if we can co-load something on the way, then that's what we intend to do. So it really irritated this particular new prospect really for us, because they just wanted their goods to get ASAP from A to B. So they found that super irritating when they'd be ordering a same day courier at 9 a.m. and the company that they was using was turning around saying, well, what's the latest it can be delivered by? As you can imagine, this customer was turning around going, what do you mean what's the latest it can be delivered by? We're ordering this at 9 a.m. It's going 3 hours north up to Newcastle. Just get it there as soon as you can. And so you've got to be really sometimes intelligent with the way you're asking it. So it might just be something like, okay, what time does the delivery point close? Or you might just be confirming it. It might just be, I've just checked on Google. It says it closes at 5 p.m. Is that right? Does that sound right to you? Something along those lines, rather than what's the latest it can be delivered by, because you might be rubbing someone up the wrong way. You also want to know the value of the goods. Do you need special goods in transit insurance for this? Is it going beyond the threshold? Is it gold? I can remember working for a company where they were literally moving gold around, and it needed a certain level of insurance to be able to cover them for that. Similarly, any special handling requirements, is there offloading facilities? Does it need a moffat? Does it need a tail lift? These are questions that you've got to be answering. I can't tell you the amount of times that I have done deliveries and the customer has said that there was no offloading facilities, like no extra offloading help required. There was stuff available at site, and the drivers turned up, and lo and behold, they're handballing a ton of material off. These are things that really the customer should be telling you, but it doesn't always work out that way. So it ends up where they're handballing. I actually had a scenario quite recently, and I'm really keen to get you guys feedback on this, to be honest, because I was a little bit irritated, I can't lie. So I had a scenario, customer says, long wheelbase van required. The goods were around, I think, 700, 800 kilo in weight. It was 2 pallets worth of goods, and the driver or the vehicle that I sent in, well-known subcontractor to us, never causes us any issue, but on this particular day, he rattled me. So 2 pallets going down from, it was going down from Yorkshire to South East London again. No, it wasn't. It was going Twickenham Way. And I give them a fairly decent price on the job, and the drivers took it down there. He's got down there. He was in a Luton though, so not a long wheelbase. Customer have asked for a long wheelbase, but they got a Luton. No issues. They were happy with it. Luton gets down to Twickenham, and the construction guys are there, and they see the tail lift on the van. They had no offloading facilities, so they basically turned around to the driver and said, "Oh, can you just get the goods down with your tail lift?" And the driver charged me for it. What's your opinion on this, guys? Because I'm a little bit divided on it. Turned out that they could get 1 pallet off, and they couldn't get the other pallet off on the tail lift because it was too heavy. But the driver rang me and said, yeah, they're wanting to get the goods off on a tail lift, so I'm going to be charging you £40 for this service. And I was like, right, okay, you've put me in a position where I can't really do anything about this, so I'm just going to have to go along with it. And then it turned out that they could only get 1 pallet off on the tail lift because the other one was too heavy. So then he only charged me 20, but then never charged me handballing fees. So what's your opinion? Because if I did the scenario again, I think I would turn around and say, no, do not take the goods off with the tail lift. Let me ring the customer and confirm this first. That, on reflection, is probably what I would have done. I think I was a little bit taken aback, to be honest, because to me, it's like, okay, if they don't use the tail lift, we're probably going to have to do a handballing fee. But then equally, he then didn't charge me handballing for the second pallet anyway, which implied that the guys on site just took it off. It baffles the brain. So yeah, please actually let me know, and I'll put a Facebook post about this actually in the scenario, and maybe something on Instagram and TikTok too. Just please give me your feedback. Let me know how you would have handled that situation. I'm really intrigued to know. So that probably leads me really well into my next part, which is choosing the right vehicle. And that can be anything from a small van right the way through to an Arctic. It might be that tail lift's required. It might be that you need someone with an ADR license that's driving the vehicle. And I can't tell you the amount of times where we've had a wrong vehicle ordered because the customer has turned round and not told us something, or they've simply requested the wrong vehicle themselves, because as I say, we give them guidelines. If they don't follow them guidelines, they know that it's on them. They're explicitly told what vehicle can take what size, and when you've got to actually inform us. We've had ample times where the goods have been, let's say for example, over 2.4 metres in length, and we've sent in a short wheelbase because that's what they've asked for. You know, it does happen so frequently, you'd be surprised. I've had literally small vans requested for 3 pallets, for crying out loud. Sometimes you do wonder what the customers are actually thinking at some points, but there we have it. And obviously, you know, the tail lifts, I've give you an example of that. That happens so frequently, where tail lifts or some sort of offloading assistance is required, whether it be a tail lift or a moffer. It really does beggars belief sometimes, but you've got to ask the right questions, and it really comes down to that information gathering at the start. That then obviously affects the pricing of the job, you know, and there's a massive amount of things that impact the pricing of the job. For us, we try to make it as simple as possible. So we price based on mileage. So every vehicle has got a set mileage. We obviously add, where appropriate, tolls. So any toll fees, any congestion charges, any ferry costs. And then we'll obviously add on things like out of hours. You know, if you're ordering a vehicle at 2 a.m. and you're waking me up, you're paying an out of hours charge. So they're things that we also add. And on top of that, if there's any storage, significant storage overnight, such as, you know, over the weekend, that, I'll be honest, it wasn't something that we initially did, but because of the amount of people that are charging us for it, we have started doing that. And that's not me slating drivers and saying they shouldn't charge us for it, but it wasn't something that we did prior, but we have started doing now. One thing that a lot of people obviously charge for is vehicle availability. Now, we don't do that, and I'll give you a clear as day example on that, which would be when England were playing, was it Mexico, that was the early hours of the morning, and we had someone requesting a vehicle. I think, again, may have spoke about this on the last episode, when sort of giving you ideas of how jobs can often work, when sometimes it just doesn't make sense to do a delivery. And that was it. We had a vehicle coming out of Felixstowe, I think it was, going up to Peterborough way, Huntingdon, and we couldn't cover the job because we got asked so late on the Friday for the Monday coverage in a I think it were an 18 ton, and we couldn't cover the job. But rather than pricing sky high and basically pissing off our customer, we simply turned around and said we can't do it. Now, people would argue that you're running a risk within itself, and we probably was, but the alternative was we price sky high and still can't cover the job, or we tell them we can't cover it, and we take that risk that they might be able to find someone that can. And I think, to be honest, they did. I'm quite confident, because I was on an email chain that implied that they did find someone to cover the job. But hey, guess what? 2 weeks later, maybe not even that, they come back to us and we've covered another 2 jobs for them since. So I always believe in just being brutally honest and maybe not taking the risks when they are a little bit too risky, to be honest. The other things you've got to consider when you're pricing the job is waiting time. And we've got a lot of jobs, not a lot, but, well, actually, no, a lie, probably a fair amount, to be honest. We've got a fair amount of jobs that run into JCB in Uttoxeter. And for anyone that's been to JCB, you'll know that taking a newspaper or an iPad where you can watch Netflix, certainly something for your boredom busters. If you've been to JCB, you've always got to make your waiting time clear. And we tell the customer from the minute that they book a JCB job, this is the price you're going to pay for a waiting time. And that varies, again, from a small van right the way through to an Arctic. We price differently on waiting time. And we tell the drivers accordingly. So when I book a driver on CX and we know that they're going to JCB, I'll explicitly tell them, this is the waiting time that we're agreeing on this job. If they don't agree to it, I don't book it with them, because, again, it's not necessarily about dictating rates, but if they can't cover it at that price, I just can't give them the job. And to be fair, for a small van, I think we pay £20 per hour for waiting time after your 30 minutes through. And I don't think that's too bad. I don't think that's too bad at all to just sit there and watch Netflix. And to be fair, our JCB jobs come quite late in the day where you're not really going to get too many loads anyway. So I think for a driver, it does work quite well to be sat there at 4 or 5 o'clock just getting paid 20 quid an hour to watch Netflix. But yeah, I think a lot of people don't price based on a per mile. They'll price on a variety of things, and I don't blame them people that do. I think for us, it's the convenience of being able to just price jobs quickly without going into too much detail. The fourth segment, I guess, if you want to call it segments of what you've got to be doing, is finding the driver. And I think this is where it gets interesting, because obviously if you're an owner driver and you've got a vehicle that's the adequate size, then happy days, you'll take it out in said vehicle. Because I think that's the other thing that you've got to consider as well when you're pricing a job. If I'm an owner driver and I'm a Luton and I intend to do every single job in my Luton, but actually the job in question is for a small van, am I pricing effectively for the customer if I'm still charging them the price of my Luton van, and I'm pricing them based on availability of that Luton van, and that Luton van, for example, might be in Worcester at the time of them wanting to book a delivery, and their delivery collection point is out of Manchester. Things like that you've obviously got to consider. So finding a driver, I guess it's balancing reliability and availability, right? And it can depend on how you, I guess, source drivers. So you might use your own existing fleet because you might have various vehicles on fleet. You might utilise owner drivers that you've got within a network you've built up. So calling on, trusted subcontractors. It might be that you use something such as the Courier Exchange or a similar sort of platform. And it's at that point, I guess, when you're using platforms and things like that, it's the trust element. Even with your subbies, your trusted subcontractors, it's still that trust element. I just give you an example before about a subcontractor that we've used ample times, but I felt in that instance that he took advantage of me, and actually he quoted on a job within 24 hours, and I think it was going to the same destination, and I point blank said, look, I'm still reeling a little bit about what happened this morning, because I posted it the same day to CX. And we had like a little bit of a back and forth on text message about it, because he rang me in the first instance and said that he quoted on the job, and I told him I was still waiting for a PO number off my customer, which I wasn't. It was a point blank lie. I only just put the job up and he quoted within minutes, which kind of tells you that like we're not bad payers, and he wanted the same price that he got when he went out there, minus the added tail lift charge, of course. But I was still reeling, as I said. So he messaged me saying, please let me know if you have any real issue related to price or anything else. We are ready to take on this job when you've got the PO number. So I simply put back, if I'm honest, I don't want to have a tail lift charge thrown at me when you reach the destination, just because the guys on site have seen it, as naturally they'd rather not handball the goods off. But yet they did with the other pallet, so it could have been handballed off. My customer was not happy at all with me when I was charging them extra for this when it wasn't required, and it wasn't required. It simply was not required. So he responded to me by saying, I understand your concern. I know it was a long wheelbase job, but the builder specifically requested a tail lift. He didn't. He absolutely didn't, which is why we confirmed it with you first. There were 2 pallets and we couldn't unload one of them without a tail lift. If you had told us at the time that you didn't want to use or pay for the tail lift, we would have refused the job with the builder straight away. After that, how they would have unloaded the pallets would have been for them to sort out. I mean, to me, it's just a crock of shite. I've seen the pictures. They could have handballed the goods off. They could have literally handballed the goods off. So I disagree with that entirely. So quite frankly, I didn't respond. I didn't give him the job. And it's led me with a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. So I guess when we're talking about that finding a driver element, You'll always learn these things. I have open conversations with drivers, and I'll gauge drivers as to how they think about things. So one of my biggest ones is, especially with the construction work that we do, is our guys will collect, they'll deliver them to site, and quite often the team at site will turn around and say, right, we've got returns. Now, we work with ample subbies on CX that will charge me a full rate for return. And I do think that's a matter of opinion. I really do. Because if you're charging me a full rate for return, I can't do it. I just can't do it, because I don't charge my customer a full rate for return. I don't charge them the full rate coming back. And if it's a round trip. And it puts me in a really difficult position when the driver's turning around saying, we're going to charge you a full rate, because how do I explain this to my customer? So my drivers took it down there. The guys at site are then trying to reload them, but he's turning around saying, no, I can't take it because we can't agree a rate. It just doesn't bode well, does it? And the worst ones, the absolute worst ones, I've had trips going to Ipswich, right? And if you've been in this game a while, you'll know Ipswich is an absolute pain in the arse to get any sort of load out of. Anywhere north of Ipswich where it's difficult. And I've got drivers charging me a full rate to do a round trip back from Ipswich. I mean, what planet are you on? Because if you took the load out to Ipswich, you ain't getting a backload at a full rate. I'm sorry. I don't care what planet you're on, whether you believe in backloads or you don't. You're not getting back out of Ipswich with a load at a decent price. So when you're charging me a ridiculous rate for a round trip, it's an absolute no. So finding the driver and balancing that reliability with availability, because again, I've had jobs where I've not been able to find drivers with absolute glowing feedback, and I have had to take sometimes an element of a risk. And I'll brief the drivers before, I'll have just a down-to-earth conversation with them, and I'll say, look, it needs to be done at X time. I can see you've had a bit of bad feedback. Can you offer me that little bit of reassurance? And I think sometimes as shippers, you need that. We need to do that a little bit more. We need to have a conversation with drivers. The amount of times that, and I've said it before about drivers doing it themselves, where they'll have a conversation with the shippers to build relationships. But I think the shippers need to do it too. We've got to make less of a habit of picking up the phone going, hi, it's Emma from X. You've bidded on my job, blah, blah. Right, thanks, cheers, I'll send it through now. And that's the end. I think both sides are guilty of ending that conversation too soon. It's the only way you build rapport. It's the only way you build trust. It's as simple as that. Right. So to recap so far, at this point, you should have done your information gathering. You should have supposedly chosen the right vehicle. You should have priced the job correctly, or so you think. And you should hopefully have found the right driver, though that might also be incorrect too. And it's probably at this point, which I'd call it segment 5, where everything goes wrong. This is where you find out how good your controller really is, because it could be anything that could go wrong. It might be that your customers measured the dimensions incorrectly, so the drivers arrived at site and actually they didn't need a long wheelbase, they needed an extra long wheelbase. It might be that the vehicle's broken down en route. It might be that the collection itself has been delayed by a couple of hours. It might be that the site is closed when they've got to delivery point. There could be traffic en route which has caused significant delays. It could be that the wrong postcode's been provided, last minute changes. And every single one of them examples that I've given you, I've suffered with, I'd say, at least within the past 2 months. And we aren't even that big, right? So you can imagine the size of some of these shippers that deal with this every freaking day, right? And it'll happen every single day. We didn't do a mass amount of jobs today, so I can't give you loads of examples. What I will say is we did have traffic incidents. If I'm not wrong, we had an 18-ton, the one that I was talking about earlier, that was going from Basildon down to Devon direction, and there were traffic on the M5, so the driver was delayed by an hour, and I just simply updated the customer. Things like that, you know, the pod, as soon as the pods come through, updating the customer straight away. These are things that a controller does, but the main things that a controller does is when it goes wrong. What I tend to do on these, before I record these pods, is I'll often put posts out there on Facebook groups, because unfortunately not everyone likes the page, and therefore not everyone sees the content that we put out and engages. So I often try and speak to people in the industry before putting a pod out to try and gauge some sort of opinion. And I can remember reading a comment which essentially said that a good controller is always busy, and I don't think that could be any more accurate. If you're a decent controller, you're always doing something, whether that be you informing the customers, catching up with the drivers, whatever it may be. As a controller, you've kind of always got to be one step ahead. I can, as I say, because every single one of them I can give you an example of. I had a job last week. It was going from Cheltenham to Birmingham and then on to Coventry. And let me tell you, it was a shit show of a job for a Friday. So the customer booked the job originally at 11 o'clock. They wanted, I think it were a 12:30 or a 1 o'clock collection. And I booked it with a company and on CX, and said company said, yeah, that's absolutely fine. I'll be there between 12 and 1. It got to 12:20 and they then told me they couldn't make the collection time. And I was like, seriously, you're already within the 1 hour window. So to me, you already knew at 11:45 that you weren't going to be able to make the actual collection time stated. So I was infuriated. And anyway, I ended up managing to find cover, which was great. I actually paid less for the cover, which I thought was strange. But that just goes to show it is all down to vehicle availability and who sees what when on CX. So we managed to get someone in to cover. And said driver goes in. He collects, I think, at about 2 o'clock. But again, this goes down to your information gathering. So my customer didn't inform me that 1, Birmingham was the most important drop that had to be completed that day. But 2, Coventry shut at 4 p.m. There was no way this driver was making both of these deliveries within the time allocated. Absolutely no way. Now, we actually took this one on the chin, because in this instance, we should have supplied a driver between 12 and 1, in which case, if the driver was there on time, the deliveries probably would have got done in time. So we couldn't turn round and actually charge the customer anymore in this instance, because it was kind of our fault. So anyway, driver collects, lands on pickup, and I gets a call from my customer about 15 minutes after he left, and he was like, can I get an ETA on the driver? So I said, I'll grab one for you in sec. Let me ring you back. He said, actually, Emma, whilst I've got you on the phone, when the driver arrived, he didn't set off immediately. He lingered. But when he got out of the vehicle, a beer bottle dropped out of the van. Well, that's fantastic, isn't it? So, of course, when I rang the shipper denied it profusely, told me that the driver was a fitness freak, and therefore that means he doesn't drink alcohol. I'm pretty sure that there's a vast majority of footballers that are professional athletes that still like to drink alcohol. But nevertheless, I said, right, okay, that's fine. But we need him to get to Birmingham ASAP for this delivery. And also, whilst I've got you on the phone, Coventry shuts at 4 o'clock. So this all comes down to the controlling element now, because we already knew between the pair of us that this driver wasn't going to make that Coventry delivery. So it was contingency planning. So ahead of time, I then arranged for another driver to come and collect said items from the driver that was delivering from his home address that thankfully was in Coventry, and it was only a couple of miles away. So essentially the driver that was doing the delivery, he delivered in Birmingham, went home, and then a second courier came and collected the goods, held them over the weekend and delivered them on Monday morning. God only knows how, but we still managed to make a little bit of profit. And it's really strange to me because we don't make, especially on our smaller vehicles, we don't make an awful lot of profit. So how we managed to still come away with £20 profit was a miracle to me, because we was prepared to take it on the chin because it went tits up. But that is literally controlling at its finest. It's getting the plans ready before they happen, because what we could have done was we could have not got the information clarified about Coventry, had the driver go to Coventry, try and drop off the goods, and then face more charges because of the fact that the delivery point was shut. So it's about saving the driver's time and saving yourself some money, because when the situation goes tits up, a good controller is there to save you as much money as possible, or keep as much money as possible. Retain those profits, find ways to keep those profits and that money with you as the shipper, rather than, I guess, the actual company. So there's a lot that goes on. If you're a decent controller, you're ahead of time, you're always planning, and you're always prepared for the worst. My next segment would probably be keeping the customer updated. And it sounds so simple, doesn't it? But again, a good controller is always going to be one step ahead. So they're going to be giving the customer ETA updates, they're going to be tracking the driver, and they're going to be, more importantly, managing expectation. Because customers, they just seem a little bit naive sometimes. So even that customer we've just talked about, where the delivery's going into Birmingham and Coventry, even booking it between 12 and 1, right? If they'd have told me that delivery needed to be in Coventry by 4 o'clock, bearing in mind this was a Friday afternoon, I'd have probably been saying, right, we realistically need a driver there at 12, because even at 1 o'clock, if you don't get that driver loaded promptly and they encounter the slightest bit of traffic on that M5, we're in a bad position and we'd be having to put contingency plans in place. So it's managing that expectation. Sometimes they seem to think that drivers will arrive and they'll do, I've got one myself tomorrow. A driver's collecting in Yorkshire, heading down to Bournemouth. And it's like, okay, what do you expect the driver to do? Get there within a record time. You're expecting them to do a very lengthy drive with no breaks, because they're asking me for an ETA before he's even collected. Well, we've booked it for an 8 o'clock collection, Emma. Does that mean he's going to deliver at 3 o'clock? Well, how long's a piece of string? And that is managing expectation, because I don't know if the driver could end up late for collection. I don't know if the driver might end up needing the toilet en route, or he might want a 45-minute break. Whatever it may be, we can't and don't know these things in advance. So it's managing expectation as it's happening. That's so key in the job of a controller. So then you're on to the final bit of your delivery, right? Which is obviously the delivery itself and the POD. A POD stands for proof of delivery, all right? And I cannot tell you the amount of times I have spoken to new people to the industry. Well, actually, I can give you one specific time of where I've referred to a pod and been looked at like I've got 4 heads. Well, actually, I've been responded with something completely different. So I told a former colleague that they needed, had they got the pod, and they sent me the postcode back. They thought when I asked for the pod, it was a typo, and I was asking for the postcode. Honestly, no words sometimes. This industry breeds different creatures, I think. So, obviously, with pods, ideally, my ideal pod is a signature and a photo. That's always the ideal pod. But sometimes photos aren't always possible. I mean, sometimes signatures aren't, but you've half a chance of a signature if you've got a blank POD than what you have a photo when you're delivering to things like a prison. We deliver to prisons quite frequently, and the drivers naturally can't take the phones in. So it's always important that they have blank pods available. But the amount of drivers, can I just say whilst we're talking about this, that don't have blank pods on CX is ridiculous. I'm also not a particular fan of when a driver takes a pod in that's branded. I've had it twice before and I've blacklisted both drivers, because I've obviously then got to send that on to my customer and it's got their branding all over it. And whilst I appreciate the fact that they've done the job for us, and I'm always appreciative of any driver that does any job for us, I don't appreciate having to send their contact details on to my customers and giving them essentially, I guess, free lead gen to a certain extent. I don't like that at all. The other thing that I think a good controller does is sending a completion email along with the POD. You know, we had a conversation about this internally recently where we talked about obviously what it's going to look like when we bring in a controller and we get them doing the job and sending the PODs and things like that. And you know, we toyed with the idea of an automated service, and actually I turned around and was like, no, I think it's really paramount for our staff and our controller to send that POD and close that job down properly. You know, it might be just thanking them for the work. It might be something funny that's happened on the job. You know, whatever it may be. We had a situation where one of our drivers went out to deliver in a power plant and he actually ended up getting drug tested whilst he was there. I mean, lo and behold, he passed, but my goodness, was we sweating in the office thinking that our driver had been drug tested. So he passed the drug test, and then it was a case of shutting the job down and making a bit of a passing joke at the fact we had to then charge them waiting time for the fact the driver had been drug tested whilst on site and had obviously passed. So things like that, again, rather than just sending a POD and an invoice, is, I guess, making light of a situation when things have gone tits up. So these are all things that you should be considering as a controller. And I said it before, said it up before and already in the pod. If you're a good controller, you're always busy. If you're shit, you're playing Sims whilst you're controlling. And believe you me, I've seen it before and I've no doubt I'll see it again. And that marks the end of this week's episode topic. So I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've taken something away from it, to be honest, as well, because I honestly, before I actually did controlling, thought it was a breeze. And I think it is. I do think controlling's a breeze if you're not doing it correctly. I really do. I used to see some of my old colleagues sit at their desk and avoid jobs that they knew were going to be difficult to cover, but they knew they had to cover them, and avoiding, you know, the contingency planning, things like that, just laziness. You know, the Sims story's true. I've legit sat there with old colleagues and they've been playing Sims whilst controlling. It's frightening. But down to our brand new feature, which again, if you listen to the pod previously, we talked about Courier Confessions, and this is essentially a brand new segment, a new feature that we've brought to the pod, and it's something that you can either do anonymously or you can put it out there and really own it, whatever it may be. And it will be a new reoccurring segment within the industry, within this pod, should I say. And we had Peter comment on our Facebook. Peter always gets involved in our content, so thank you, Peter. This one is a little bit frightening though, right? Because I would not like to have been this particular driver. So Peter put on, way back in the day when the first PlayStation came out, we had a contract from Sony to swap out any broken ones around the country. Sony being Sony decided they wanted to make a video of a driver and van delivering. The van was scrubbed and sign written, and the shoot was sorted for the next day at 10 a.m. The driver took the van home, had a couple of deliveries lined up for first thing, sadly went out that night and had a few pints and a curry. He did the deliveries in the morning but rung me and said he had a stomach issue. It was rumbling badly. I told him to get a move on. There was a film crew waiting. He phoned me from around the corner and told me to come and meet him. Yup, his backside had exploded. He had tried to use a Mr. Kipling box, which had failed to contain it. There was crap everywhere and a film crew round the corner. It also stunk. How we got away with making that video without opening the back doors, I'll never know. Peter's offered to name the driver, and I've explained that I think it would be nice for him to keep the little bit of dignity he has intact. But yeah, guys, if you have a courier confession, please get in touch. It doesn't need to be that humiliating. It can be something a little more, well, I don't even know the word, but certainly not humiliating for the driver like that. It can be something else. You might have poached a customer. Whatever it may be, please get in touch with your courier confessions. For now, what I will say is The next time you book a same-day courier, remember there's a whole team 99% of the time making sure that delivery happens. It's not always just a driver in a van, and even if it is, it always takes planning, communication, problem solving, and a lot of quick decisions behind the scenes. Please, again, if you've got any courier confessions, make sure you send them in. I'll leave the details in the description. You can feel free to contact us via Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, whatever it may be. And please, 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 if you can, follow, subscribe, leave a review, rank us 5 stars. It's super, super appreciated. And hopefully, I'll see you on the next episode. Thank you.